Welcome, everyone, to another episode of HR and Payroll 2.0. As always, I'm Pete Tiliakis, and I'm joined by the legendary Julie Fernandez. Welcome, Julie.
Hey, Pete. How are you? Good to hear you.
Good. How's it going?
Great.
What's that?
Great.
Yeah.
I'm in the warm, away from my usual frigid Detroit temperatures.
Good for you. Good for you. Yeah, I understand you're in Florida, right? You've been doing a little bit of event going this week, if I understand correctly.
That's absolutely right. So I don't know if our listeners know about some of the bigger HR conferences, but the one that I was at just earlier this week is called NARES, which stands for the North America HR Executive Summit.
Nice.
So
I've not been there.
It's an interesting conference. They tend to have peer speakers, and they usually draw 500 to 600 or so HR leaders. So they specifically target folks that have, some sort of responsibility, usually some budget, a lot of business partners are there, and then higher level titles, director and above, kind of peers that you can network with over the course of 2 days, 2 very, very busy days.
Yeah, I bet. And then that was in Orlando, right?
That was in Orlando at the Champions Gate. And some of the, a lot of people ask me, kind of who attends and who speaks. And so you have some great speakers coming from, all of the folks that people want to hear from. McDonald's was there, Pfizer, P&G, J&J is there, Jazz Pharmaceuticals spoke. So you get, some attractive kind of people along an experienced journey, and it's peers speaking more than, providers. People don't really want to hear providers speak. They want to hear from other HR practitioners, right? And
yeah.
So that's a big draw. And they just, have a couple of jam-packed days. About half of the attendees are from what I would call, mid to large size organizations. And the other half are generally from, smaller, maybe, 2,000 and below sized organizations. So, no matter what your size is, you're bound to find yourself at table after table of peers that are either bigger than you or right in your same mix. So
it sounds like
conference.
Yeah. Good stuff. Yeah. It's nice. I mean, I think that sometimes these conferences get a little bit, I think people think that they're just sort of, maybe a boondoggle, right? In some leaders, but I actually think there's so much value in that networking part of it, right? It's just that trade of information. I know I personally, as an analyst and just as a professional, I always get so much out of the conversations. Just learning about things that I may not be thinking about. And especially when you're a practitioner and, you're going through what you think is the, world ending or world changing challenges and you think you're the only one. It's very refreshing to be in and amongst peers that you can bounce these moments off of and situations and understand how others are solving it in your industry or in your set of challenges or even just outside and maybe give you some perspective. So I'm happy to see that we're getting back to events and people are attending. And this is one I'm not familiar with, but maybe someday we'll I'll get to check it out. So very good.
That's right. If anyone's ever looking for information on what sort of conferences there are for what types of topics, I think either one of us would be a pretty good source. To share some of the.
We've been to a few.
Exactly.
Good. So let's talk about maybe some market updates. Is that cool? We got a few here. All right. So let's start with the first one. Not a big announcement here. This had already happened a while back, but the deal closed. And no pun intended here, but deal, DEEL, closed its deal, DEAL, with PayAsia. And as you know, Pay Group or PayAsia was a very formidable Asia Pac based, payroll. I would say EOR, multi-country payroll, EOR, and even an HCM technology provider, which has gone off to Deal, which is a global EOR solution provider that obviously has global payroll aspirations, just like many. And so, really building out their capability, their regional capability. This fills a big gap in their offering. And congrats to Mark Samalol and team over at Pay Group and PayAsia.
Indeed.
I worked with those guys a bit myself over the years and always thought very highly of them and their team.
Same
and really
here.
happy to see this. So yeah, I think
Yeah,
this
they
is
have a great leadership team. You know what struck me on
yeah,
this, Pete, besides the fact that I know
yeah,
you posted about it actually quite a while ago when it was announced with some good stats on, the impacts of the sizes coming together. But what strikes me is, Ceridian went on a tear and, bought up Excelity and also
yes,
Ascender. And so
yep,
that left PayGroup or PayAsia as one of the, the bigger players left in the region.
yeah.
And so, now seeing these guys come together, the Asia marketplace has really been kind of um, spread out and gobbled up, right?
Yeah, it has. Yeah, I mean, it's like I've watched a lot of these regional players kind of grow up and mature and ultimately do this. And it's on the one hand, it's bittersweet. It's like I'm really happy for them. They find a home to further their investment and obviously continue building on what they've done. But at the same time, I just they have their own little culture and their own sort of identity. As you see them grow up, you hate to see that sort of go away. But I'm sure they're going to bring some great insights to Deal. And Deal, obviously, very well known for putting a lot into their software and their solution. Is saying by H1 2023 they will have a merged version of their capabilities and software. So integration is well underway, and it's going to be interesting to see if they stop here, right? If
Yeah.
more acquisitions
Yeah,
are on the radar. I think you're going to see more in the industry for sure. Will they be a deal? Not sure, but yeah. So
for
that one's
sure.
well on its way.
Hey, so
But you got
I
another
have a
one,
new
right?
one. Yep, I got a
Yeah,
new one for you, and it'll be interesting to see what pans out. But I noticed that Vizier. I'm not sure exactly what the proper. I've heard folks calling it both ways, Vizier and HR.com. Announced a
yeah,
partnership. Now, this is one of those where kind of remains to be seen what comes of this. But if you think about it, Vizier is the people analytics, right? Long established as a kind of a leader in that space. And HR.com is more of an online community of HR practitioners. And so along with this announcement came the idea that together they can bring resources that will help HR practitioners build their personal and organizational analytics skills. So it's digging in to see, like, what does that mean, right? What will HR.com practitioners or people who are using HR.com community get? And besides kind of the obvious webinars and maybe some starter guides for people analytics or thought leadership content, I saw what might be more interesting is direct access through HR.com to Vizier's benchmarks. And so just digging a little bit into, what does that mean? What does that look like? I think I saw over 20 million employee records. And the types of data that are assembled in those benchmarks are career progression and exit and diversity metrics. And that's across the last few years in 22 different industries. So,
good.
if you're
Yeah, good
looking for
stuff.
some interesting benchmarks, it might
Yeah.
just be that HR.com and Vizier are finding kind of a unique delivery model to get some of that out there for HR practitioners.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff. And yeah, I think the benchmarking is becoming more standard in many solutions now across the spectrum of HR. So it's good stuff, right? It's, data is HR and payroll's oil or gold. And I think that everyone is trying to tap into that, right?
Yep, yep.
And as we know, right, it's not been that easy. There's a lot of organizations I've talked to who have, I think we saw it, right? We talked about the data from Stacy over at
Yeah, Sapient
Sapient, that
Insights. Yeah,
analytics was one of the top three with time and payroll that are going to be replaced or want to be replaced by firms. And I think that's some of that is frustration with the solutions not being as intuitive, maybe as folks might have thought, right? I've seen a lot of folks who they get into these things, but they don't know how do you do analytics, right? That might be an episode, but I think there's a lot of struggle people still have at really actionabilizing that data, if that's a word.
yeah. Yep, yep.
And I think that these solutions are trying to get more helpful, bringing partners together to give people the power in their data. And the benchmarks, I think, are huge, right? When, there's these mass data pools now around the world. Many of the vendors in the marketplace are offering sort of anonymized benchmarking capabilities now. And that's it's so valuable, right? To be able to look at yourself in context with others and figure out, are you on the road? Do you have, are you heading the right direction or not? So yeah, good
Right.
stuff. I'm really
Yeah.
happy to see that one. Yeah. I have one last one here, and this one obviously hits a little close to home. So, Alight Solutions announced this week they've acquired Reed Group. I wasn't personally familiar with Reed Group, but they are
Mhm.
an entity of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, which Alight has purchased that from. And they are a data-driven absence and leave management solution provider.
That's right.
If you know leaves, you know leaves are. I'll just go on record and say they suck. Right? It's difficult. There used to be not a lot of solutions out there to help you, or even a lot of service providers that would take that work. It's complicated, but it's also incredibly important when you think about the wellness picture, and fits perfectly into what Alight, is going for here. So yeah,
Yeah.
Regroup is bringing, a capability that aligns well with Alight's body of work, right? They do tend to sort of target upmarket. They work with, nearly half of the Fortune 100 companies across 6 continents. And really do offer a wide range of solutions from outsourcing and co-sourcing to SaaS and then, of course, clinical guidelines. So
Yeah.
a
And
nice little fold in for Alight. Yeah.
for sure. And for anyone in that absence leave space or feeling those pains, Reed Group has been one of the longest
Yeah.
established, maybe, niche providers or best of breed providers in that space. So super well known, in that space, and lots of different ways to tap into them. I'll be most interested to see, Alight has quite a healthy bench of Workday clients, and
Yes.
the pains, the very real client pains that we hear in the absence and leave space, where they touch Workday, and not just Workday, right? Every one of the HCM providers. But I'll be most interested to see if maybe Alight can't make some secret sauce out of the pains that Workday clients feel in dealing with their leave and absence touch points. So
Yeah, I would agree. I don't recall, just from my, I haven't spent a lot of time in this world, but over my years working around HRO deals and advisory and whatever, I don't know that there's a lot of solutions for leaves, and it can be sticky, right? It's a complicated process, and it's funny because, well, it's not funny, but a lot of times in deals I worked on in my past, we would have to carve that off because we didn't do that
yeah.
in some of my some of my past worlds. So I think that's one of those solutions that is everyone needs it, and yeah, it's nice to see it's landing in a home where it kind of fits in line with a broader wellness
For
sort of
sure.
focus. So
I'm
yeah.
sure you don't know this, but we have a very specialized group. It's actually part of a sister company to Heron Palmer that does exclusively leave and absence
Awesome.
activities. Everything from searching for the technology to co-source solutions to even some of the design, attributes and updating of leave and absence policies and programs, especially post COVID. There's just a huge amount of activity going on there. And if, for anyone that is having those issues or is even just looking to understand the landscape, that's an area that we have some deep expertise in. So,
Yeah.
folks
Very
can
good.
always feel free to reach out, and I'll make sure to get you connected to somebody who can tell you what's going on and who the players are in that space.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that it is a tricky world, and like I said, I think it's a little foggy. I couldn't name off too many providers that actually do this. So yeah, agreed. That's great stuff. So good to know. I didn't know that.
I didn't think you did.
Very cool. Man, now our audience does. So very good, very good.
Yeah,
Okay, I think that's it for our news. Am I right, Julie? I think we got them
I
all. That's all
think.
I know of.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's all I
awesome.
think I've got on my radar.
So let's dive into our topic of the week. And this, again, another personal wanting to learn, so to speak, right? We're going to talk sourcing advisors. What the hell are they? What do they do? Why do you need it? Do I not need it? Where do I need them? What do they, how do they help me? That sort of thing. And I thought, who else in the world to talk about that? But you, Julie. I just for fun fact, I don't know if you recall this, Julie, but in my past days, in my IBM days, I know we worked on deals where I was on the vendor side. You were on the, I think, TPI at that point.
Yes.
And you've worked on a lot of deals in this capacity. Am I right?
You are right. In fact, I think I kind of shamelessly, ISG, my former employer, shamelessly would say I've worked on really many of the most complex deals in the industry, across very large, enormous global providers and initiatives. And this whole area just gets me so excited. I love I love solutioning in this area. So yeah, I
Yeah,
do remember
I
we've
know.
been on both sides of the fence together.
So that's exactly why I call you legendary, right? Because you have worked on so many of these mega deals, and this stuff is hard. I mean, look, I've worked on some big deals myself on the other side as a solution architect,
Mhm.
pre-sales, that sort of thing. I've even been a sourcing advisor in my Deloitte days, and done some platform selections. I've done certainly outsourcing selections. And being on this side now and having a bit more time where I'm spending looking at deals and watching what buyers are sort of going through and listening to our team, it got me to thinking about just the whole role of sourcing advisors, right? I still don't see enough of them being used. I don't see enough deals coming through. Um, Personally, I think there's still a lot of firms that are sourcing led, procurement led. And I think they feel like, look, we've got this rich, robust sourcing team. We know how to do this. We can run with it. But I would argue that, especially in HR, it's not like buying any other solution or service, right? I've said this, on the podcast before. You're not buying staples or reams of paper. You're not buying servers. You're partnering with an organization to hand over potentially one of the most important processes, some of the many of the most important processes in your organization. And you are really going into this arm's length relationship with someone that is supposed to operate on your behalf for your people, right? Your most valuable asset. So I just think that of all the things you can be buying out there, right? This is where I think you really do need help. So I just want to pause there, Julian, get your thoughts on just that perspective of companies kind of going at it alone versus
Yep.
companies, going in and getting and recognizing that they can get the best sort of experience, if you will, and result by having some sort of help. So what are your thoughts just on that point of view?
Yeah, well, so first of all, just thinking about this historically, right? Historically, there wasn't this advisory space, this sourcing advisory space, before the days of GM starting to outsource its IT space to EDS. I mean, that really is when we started to see large companies try a different delivery model with some of their back office activities.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned TPI, where was initially was kind of the godfather of this industry, right? Especially in the IT space, where they really started looking at companies that were trying to deliver their back office services differently, and decided, like let's help, let's facilitate this happening. And so for quite a while in the space, it was it was very niche and very unique. And I think what's causing folks now, fast forward 20 plus years forward, and what's causing folks to think about doing it themselves is kind of twofold. Sometimes it's within the functional area. So HR will say, this is complex and I know my business, and I'm gonna, start talking to folks in the market. Other times there's a real expectation that an organization's procurement lead and drive these sorts of processes. So let me start with the procurement one, because you
Yeah.
referred to it. Like, it's not like buying, your supplies, your core business supplies.
Yeah. Not at
Pro-
all.
Procurement can get, has a really important role in any sourcing process, including the HR ones. And what I like to see procurement doing in these types of sourcing exercises is bringing that client specific intel, those needs, those questionnaires and exhibits that have to be a part of any sourcing exercise because you are company XYZ, right? That's a very big value add for procurement in these areas. Sometimes the scoring methodology, some companies have, kind of a standard or a typical scoring methodology that they use across their businesses, whether it's paper or whether it's back office supplies. And
Yeah.
so if you need to follow those rigors, great scoring methodology. Same thing can happen with business case or CapEx and funding approvals and requirements. Those are value add items. But beyond that, HR buying is, it's not a commodity. And so you have to solution as you're going through the sourcing process. And that's something that not all organizations or procurement is used to doing or comfortable doing, because it really requires functional knowledge. You have to
Yes.
understand. the function and the different parts of the function and what the alternatives are, because you're solutioning as you're buying. You're not just picking off of a menu list, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that I see a lot of is, and I've been in my sourcing advisor days, I've been, in the middle of this, so to speak, is that you get a lot of firms that rush out there and they just want a price, right? Can you just price
Yeah.
this thing? And I think that's super dangerous. I think that's super short-sighted. And I think most of those companies, depending upon what they're actually trying to do. If it's a small point solution like printing checks or something, okay. But if you're talking about actual managed services or talking about transformation, um, I just think that's a rough way to go about it. So how do you, because I know what I see on the vendor side, right? It oftentimes when you have buyers coming into these engagements without help, without that third party guidance, or at least the experience, real HR buying experience. And many firms are, second and third generation buyers of HRO and HR solutions, modern solutions at this point. But you find a lot of them come into this, like I said, unprepared, so to speak, for what the process is and how to actually navigate it to the best of their advantage. And I think that puts a lot of vendors in a position to have to kind of down throttle, if you will, and back up and consult them, right? And here at Alight, where I work now, we have a very good professional services organization where we have the ability to actually do that for customers. In fact, I'd say it's a key differentiator, and it's something that we're trying to make a norm as part of our global payroll work, particularly. But how do you get, Julie? How do you get these firms to sort of step back and say, this is an investment that you need to make, and here's why. Look, it's going to lend itself to a better outcome in many, many ways, better experience. But how do you get them to throttle back? Because I think what happens is, or get them to focus on that, because I think it puts vendors in a position to have to sort of play consultant, coach, sourcing advisor at the same time, trying to sort of obviously help them get to the right answer. But how do you convince a company to slow down and say, look, you do need help, right? And here's where the value can come from that help. And you don't need to do this alone, right? And gamble with, figuring out as you go. We've already got all the kind of cheat codes, if you will, over here, so to speak. So what
Yeah.
are your thoughts on that part of it?
Well, some companies are either mature enough or stretched thin enough that they know
Yeah.
right from the get go we need help, right? So those
Yep.
those aren't the folks that you're talking about right now. Other companies, will want to engage with providers right away, and the providers, of course, all want a sole source, right? So they all want to be the guy to position themselves not only to share their services and capabilities, but also to try to provide that guidance or that leadership or navigation. And so initially, if a provider thinks that they have a sole source type of a conversation going with a client, they're quite happy to continue and do most anything, right? They can to try to
Yeah.
have that, to try to help give that guidance themselves. But I will tell you, over the long haul, generally providers prefer to see an advisor involved.
Yes.
And
Yes.
for many reasons. Like, first of all, you're not trying to navigate all of that stuff, all the conversation that a client doesn't really want to share entirely with you usually. But if you're serious enough to pay an advisor, to help navigate the process and make sure that it goes off, then you're going to be serious enough to stay on track in your timeline. You're going to be serious enough to actually reach a decision. And it also means that you have engagement and buy-in of leadership. You had to get that in order to bring an advisor in the first place. And so
Yeah.
those are the three, like the three slam dunks that will cause a provider to say, Julie, I'm happy to see you involved in this process because it gives me more conviction that this client is a serious client.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does signal. I think it does signal, and it does show a maturity, right? That says, we understand this is complicated. We're bringing in help, and I'll be honest with you, I'd say it's less than 50%. I see actually doing it, and I wish I could say we could see more.
Yeah.
And I think you pointed out something very important there. That I want to get to, and I think you were alluding to relationships, right? And I think that's one of the overlooked, not just the relationships, the methodologies, the You've been you've been there, done that sort of, you've seen the good and bad and the ugly, right? So you know how to kind of, guide people the right way. But what I think is important there in those pieces that you're bringing to the table as a sourcing advisor, or that they bring to the table, is it's not just about them getting you the best price and terms. Certainly that's the goal, but there's so much more that sourcing advisors do and bring an offer for buyers, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that? How do you think buyers see that value at first, or do you think it's something that they have to kind of learn?
Yeah, I do. You mentioned something interesting about it not just being the best terms, the best buy terms. And I would tell
Yeah.
you, the heavy lifting that a sourcing advisor does is earlier on in the process. And in fact, very often when you get to the point where you're starting to talk about contracting and terms and conditions, that's a very light role where
Yeah.
those things procurement and legal do all day long. They do need to know the nuances or the specifics of the market. So many providers don't work off of client paper. They work off of, paper that reflects a shared model or a SaaS type model. And so you need to know what the market norms are, but that's not where you need the heavy lift of a sourcing advisor. The heavy lift is in, first of all, relationships. You may see these providers from time to time, even if you're in HR and you're an HR leader, you've probably worked with many of them in the past, but a sourcing advisor sees them in the sales and transition capacity over and over and over, and again, a dozen times or,
Yeah.
dozens of times a year.
Yeah.
And that type of insight is not something that you can easily have in-house yourself. So that's a big one. And you mentioned methodologies and templates. I mean, that's obvious. You don't want to start from scratch. You also, are kind of wasting a little bit of time if you're asking for things in an RFP that are outside of market norm. You really want somebody to tell you, like, that's not normal. That's not a normal part of delivery. Doesn't mean that maybe your providers won't do that for you, but you should expect that you're driving up cost by asking for X, Y, and Z. And if that's your intent, and you have to have it and you're willing to pay for it, great. I can't tell you how many conversations I've started with, they have to speak, a call center has to speak every language of every one of my employees all along the globe. And I'm like, you can ask for that, but you're not going to be able to afford that. So if you're in 50 countries,
Yeah.
we can get real now or we can get real later, right?
Yep.
But let's go into this with our eyes wide open.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned very, very, I think very quickly, as I was doing, I've been on all sides of the sourcing lifecycle myself. I've selected these solutions. I have obviously studied them now, but at some point in my career, I had been in pre-sales, I had been in solutioning, but then I was also then at some point on the governance side where I was managing a contract that was, after it's been negotiated, gone live, here you go, we're running it globally, right? And I think what I learned from that experience personally is how critical it is that these deals are not lopsided.
Yeah.
I have seen deals where the vendor had absolutely positively no wins, right? It just was an imbalanced deal financially. It was an imbalanced deal just in every way possible. And it wasn't successful, right? In some cases, I've seen those things. And so I think that's important to talk, Julie, a little bit about how do you get to a win-win for both buyer and supplier so that it is a mutually beneficial arrangement financially and just, otherwise over the course of the deal. Because I think the worst thing you can do is enter into this marriage, right? This 7-year, 5-year thing that is so intimate, right, to your organization, your human capital, right, your people. It's in it, whether it's payroll or it's anything else, it's going to impact them directly, right? How do you balance that so that it isn't lopsided for the buyer or lopsided for the vendor, and then there's this unhappiness and eventually it just falls apart or it doesn't work? How do you do that as a sourcing advisor, Julie? How do you balance all that? Because I think that's
Yeah.
a key piece that they do,
It,
right?
it is
Service they
something.
provide.
It is something that's pretty key, and part of it is about acknowledging that you can't squeeze the blood, the lifeblood out of a provider arrangement, or you will pay for it. That you either won't get the services or your services will fail. You want a provider to have a reasonable margin. You don't want them to have excessive margin. So one of the ways that you do that is by working with an advisor who sees over and over again and knows what a healthy margin looks like, right?
Yeah.
And is
Yeah.
still doing the, they're really still working on your behalf to get you the best deal possible. But it's not
Yes.
always about the dollars, the flat dollar amount. Of course, that's where everybody's attention is, but it's also about asking for services or delivery models or activities that are outside of the norm of a delivery model. And that's an area where folks feel a lot of pain because you try so hard to get the things that, fill your gaps from the client perspective, right? Like I have to have them do it this way and they're telling me they don't normally, but I could push them and they'll be willing to do this. That just creates pain points in their delivery model that are likely to feel if there's too many of them, if they're not in reasonable areas, or if they're just likely to fail between the sales messaging and then the delivery arm that actually has to transition, stand up, and execute that. And so
Yeah.
knowing what those are before you press for those as part of your managed services arrangement is really important insight that
Yeah.
that any sourcing advisory should be giving you.
Totally. And how much do you get involved in helping coach them along the lines of their retained team and the whole governance process? Do you I mean, I know the answer to this
Mm-hmm.
myself, but maybe talk about a little bit about that, because I think that's a hard part that I don't know that's where sometimes good deals can fall apart, is in that governance piece, right? Like I've
It
seen
is.
that where the people weren't able to execute, or the governance model just wasn't good. And they just didn't have the right resources, or for whatever reason, the culture just wasn't into it. But talk about that a little bit. What do you feel about that piece? How do you manage that?
Yeah, sure. Let me start by saying, that's not usually what's on folks' mind when they're going
Yeah.
into the sourcing exercise. So a lot
Yeah.
of times
Right.
that's not in an initial
But it's so
scope.
important. It's so
And it
important.
is important, but you do end up doubling back to it. So, first of all, I have a fundamental belief that, when you're buying services in HR or technology in HR, ultimately the relationship that needs to be successful is between you and the vendor, right? So you don't need or want a consulting firm to just hang around eternally, as kind of a part of that relationship. You want to have a healthy relationship between the two of you. When that is not contemplated up front, and it usually doesn't even start to get really contemplated by most firms until after implementation, which again, I'm not saying is the best way to do that, but you do then come back around and recognize whether it's part of renewal, whether it's part of post transition, stabilization, that you should have had those tenets of healthy governance designed in from the get-go. And not only that, but you should have, the ideal situation for transformation is to have folks implementation roles involved in the rolling out, the design and the rollout of services, and have those resources go into roles that have a role in governance as well, right? So that you get that continuity from the very beginning of requirements through transition and into ongoing governance. And that takes a lot of planning. Let's be honest, that's not usually the way we staff and plan our projects up front. And so we do get involved quite often in those areas, but it's usually as an afterthought. It's usually if things have gone rocky, or it's usually as the folks are thinking about going into renewal.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
actually, that's an interesting thing to talk about as well, is renewal, Pete, because it's not like you're sourcing or buying the first time around. That's usually what people think when they think about sourcing advisory. But as you come up on a term or a major change, even if it's before your term, your initial term is expired, those are all opportunities for you as a buyer to look at what's new in the marketplace, what's new with your provider, and what sort of leverage or changes would be healthy to your arrangement and advantageous to you, of course, and are reasonable to ask for. And so, and renewal engagement has as many elements of sourcing as a net new sourcing engagement has, and includes a lot of strategies about how or when do I ask for these things? How should I mold this relationship so that it remains healthy and we're not falling behind.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So look, I think we would be remiss, Julie, if we didn't add the one thing that I think is probably, in my opinion, the most valuable, but also maybe the most overlooked as far as sourcing advisors go, is that the risk reduction or the risk avoidance element of this, right? I think that's the key benefit that really, in my opinion, the sourcing advisors bring to the table is just risk reduction. Um, Talk about that a little bit. But what do you see as some of the risks? And do you agree with that? Do you feel like that's the most important part of what you do when you're working with customers?
I feel like it's something that you should get table stakes from
Yeah.
any good advisor. It's not usually the thing that people come to you, with their poke
Yeah.
list and say, "Hey, I
Yeah.
really want you to reduce my risk in this,"
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that.
But it's key though, right?
It is. It is. And there's so many things that are key in the area of risk reduction. I think we've talked about a few where whether it's asking for things that are outside of the norm and the risk that could present itself, the expectations of the buy, and even on your own side, the expectations of cost and of funding so that you can actually get through approvals and hurdles. Some of the risks that I think are most reduced in today's market, or the things that you should really try to reduce risk on, include kind of the a roadmap for funding and execution, because some of these larger initiatives are multi-year or multifaceted things, and you actually really need to think about when do I need to go live, and how long do I need to do all the different parts, and what about the next phase of services or modules, and being able to think and back things into logical timelines is not usually something that comes naturally or quickly to folks that are trying to do it themselves,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
don't deal in HR a lot. The other thing is just the transition resources, right? So
Good.
if
Yeah.
you think about, the transition and providers that either do it themselves, or you go to a systems integrator market and you get a specialist that does transition, their whole perspective is founded on their role to configure and get the product live or the services live, right? So they're
Right.
very
Right.
laser focused on that, and there will be placeholders for the client activities, the key client activities, but that isn't enough to describe all of the connections and the underlying work that has to be done by the client side
Yeah.
resources in order
Yep.
to have a successful transition or transformation. And so that sort of planning and de-risking is probably one of the biggest areas that we're getting involved in often, because today you can't just ask folks to double hat, triple hat, quadruple hat.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
not the
They
right job
already are.
market.
They already are.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so the planning part of it is just really huge. It's a huge element for success. It's almost an element much like change management, right? That can be ignored at your own peril.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And Julie, do you think that? So I've really only worked with, or I'm thinking about my times as a sourcing advisor and times I've worked on deals. I've generally only worked with firms who, from the get go, right? They had a sourcing advisor or they had some sort of help. What if you get mid project, midway through your sourcing, midway through whatever you're doing, and you realize we're in over our head? We need help. Can a sourcing advisor kind of step in and help at that point, or is it just too late?
No,
Is there
you
a salvage, job you can do at that point, right?
Oh, you definitely can.
Yeah.
So, I've been involved in multiple client engagements where, there was failure. And so, you're having conversations after two or three failed attempts. Sometimes I'm working with one client that has had four failed attempts in prior goes at this. And so that's possible. I would even tell you, I talk to many companies that start down just the RFP path or the RFI path
Yeah.
themselves,
Hmm.
and they get so far and they engage providers. Now they have providers calling them, three times a week, right? So you create a
Yeah.
little bit of your own noise
Yeah.
and nightmare, but
It's
they
like
get so
throwing blood in the water.
they get so far along and they're like, okay, we can do this. And then they get stuff back and it's like
Yeah.
apple fruit and buses, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
not apples to apples. And so they're like, oh my, I'm not even sure I know how to do justice to
Yeah.
compare these things. And like, they don't look right. Are they truthful? And so oftentimes we'll get engaged, even even after a client started that. And the the approach there is, let's work with what you have, but we're probably going to have some gaps you need to close, or maybe have that market knowledge and proficiency to be able to just help you put a bow on it and make sure that you're looking at it right.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
absolutely happens. It's
Yeah.
not ideal, but it does happen.
Yeah, awesome. So let me ask you this: how would you recommend somebody go about selecting a sourcing advisor? Like, how do you qualify and figure out what is the right? When you're buying solutions for your business, right? You're looking at use cases and all those sorts of things. You're fitting it to the needs of your culture and your organization's processes. But what do you do in this case when you know, is this all about relationships? I mean, how do you select an advisor in this case?
Yeah, it can be. It definitely is. There's an element of relationships to even know who plays in the
Yeah,
space or who's good at this. And I would tell you that there are a lot of folks, that are happy to do some advising. The very number one thing that I tell HR buyers or organizations is look at the downstream interests for starters, because many
yeah,
folks who are happy to advise because they want to be the one to do X, Y, or Z, right? So
yeah,
so they have a direct incentive, and that doesn't mean that they can't advise. It just means, they might not be the most neutral or unbiased play. They might not really, they might have an element that keeps them from working solely on your behalf as
yeah,
part of that. So that's really big. And then I would say, you really do need to. Some folks will do a full RFP to select a sourcing
yep,
advisor.
yep,
All I can say there is just make sure, like if you're going to spend 6 months selecting an advisor, you probably are going to, like think about leaving not just 2 months to select your software, select your,
yeah,
a lot of times they'll spend so much time up front, and then the sourcing advisor, they tell them you got to get this done in 3 months. I'm like, what? You've
yes,
been dealing
yeah.
with me for 8 months. How,
I
and you want
know.
this done in three? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that was one of the hardest things about my time as a sourcing advisor. I remember we had a few clients, big clients I worked with that I had one that wanted to do a hybrid RFI, RFP, somewhere in between that, I guess you could say. It was almost like an RFI with pricing, I think, and demos, by the way, which I really tried to encourage them not to do this. And they had a reputation. They were a do nothing buyer. They had a reputation for kind of doing this every 3 or 4 years. And I really tried to take them in a different direction, but it was very difficult. They were
Mm-hmm,
just so, it was almost kind of a waste having us in some ways, because I feel like they kind of didn't listen to us well in some regards.
mm-hmm,
It worked out in the end, but I think that we've talked about this before about getting a reputation, right? Sometimes as organizations, if you are kind of out there doing this sort of wishy-washy, RFI one day, RFP the next, and every other year you're doing this, and you're not actually going forward with anything. People are going to kind of not take you serious, right?
yeah,
And it's going to be hard to get firms to work with you. So I think when and where you can bring sourcing advisors in, I personally have seen a lot of great experiences from that, and
yeah.
firms do much better, in my opinion, just from what I've seen.
Yeah, I think a
Um,
good process lets the advisor
yeah,
not only respond to what you're asking for, but also says what
yeah,
else, what other value adds should we be thinking about? And
yeah,
a good process will consider, some of the things you're bound to hear some new things. I would also tell you, there are sourcing advisors and there are HR advisors that do more than sourcing, right? So
yes,
they won't
yes.
just execute the RFP. They can do strategies. They can bring benchmarks. They can do other pieces of the HR transformation advisory, and that's really valuable, because then you get somebody who says, I answered an RFP once, about 2 years back. They wanted a sourcing advisor for their HCM, and they knew they were going to go to the cloud. They knew they needed to buy that. They knew they needed to buy the SI, and they said, what else? And so, we responded and said, well, you really should be looking at optimizing and harmonizing your processes, and you should be looking at your operating models so that you're clear on the operating model that you're moving to. That's what you're going to configure. And, many clients don't have the appetite or the timeline or the resources for that. But when you do, there's just as much work outside of the sourcing exercise itself to be done in preparing the organization, for its operating model of the future. And I think a lot of folks miss that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's work. That's a good word to use. It's work. It's hard, and this is a bit of a puzzle, right? And when you know how to navigate that puzzle from past experience, what better, what better way to go about it than trying to sort of guess, right?
It
If you
is.
have someone who can give you the cheat codes, if you will,
Yeah.
I guess it would be very beneficial.
You
So
know, let's talk
yeah,
magnitude too. When
yeah,
you're thinking about, geez, let me just do it myself because an advisor is going to cost,
yeah,
some money. Well, and the advisory role is kind of a one-time discrete amount of effort, right? And
yep,
and
yep,
usually the services or the software that you're buying is easily 10x plus, right?
yes, yeah,
So while there's a discrete cost to it, it's not an unmanageable cost, and it can be scoped in a number of different ways depending on your team resources. And, to go into a large multi-million dollar buy with
yeah.
some sort of a guide, that cost is, really quite small compared to the
It
funding
is.
ask that you're going to have to be prepared to get approval for.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I would agree. I think when you put it in that context, yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think a lot of organizations do think, oh, we've bought stuff before, we can do this. Again, I think it goes back to those probably procurement led firms that are very, we've got these very skilled, savvy procurement folks, but again, it's just not buying the same thing.
That's right.
As you might buy, something else. So
That's
I
right.
think we've probably hit on everything we wanted to.
I
Julie, anything else here? I have something kind of lighthearted I want to talk to you about really quick before we wrap up. If not, but
No.
anything
Well,
that you think we didn't touch on here?
let me just throw out one thing.
Yeah,
One last thing. Anyone who does this for a living, like
yeah,
who plays a role like this for a living, is happy to have conversation with you, whether that leads to an engagement or
yes,
not. Right. So this is a world that we live in, that we play in. You as an analyst have been, in other sides of the thing now at Alight, in a different role. So there are different roles in this whole
yeah,
process, but it is this, it is kind of the center of our career and professional insights and knowledge. And so you don't have to, be determined to hire somebody. You can think you're actually not going to hire someone and still reach out and have a really great conversation with somebody who does this all the time. And you'll learn from it,
yeah,
and they'll learn from you as well. And, if you need some help, then generally they'll be happy to help. And if you don't, that's okay. This is still a
yeah.
part of their expertise and sharing in our industry that you ought to be able to get some good conversations, some good insights.
Yeah, absolutely. Get in touch, right? And ask those questions and qualify that and see if you are truly able to handle it or not, and where you can, get some help. Because, yeah, I've just personally, I've not done research on this, but anecdotally, I just see a better outcome, and a better process and experience for the buyer and the vendor when this is in place, and they have help. And they have some sort of a framework and path, and they do have guidance. Someone giving them those sort of, again, cheat codes along the way to help them, not bump their heads. So,
It's all about
um,
finding something actionable, right? And not getting,
yeah,
trying to stay out of the do nothing box as often
yeah,
as much
uh,
as possible.
yeah. Refer back to episode 1 if you for that. But yeah, I hate to see buyers go through that because it's
Yeah.
a lot of cost and work for everybody, even the vendors, right? I
Yeah.
mean, we all know of companies who go out to market every so many years and they do this same thing, and it becomes like, oh, here we go again. And you don't want that, right? You don't want that
No.
reputation. You really do want to be out there doing things purposefully. I've always had this theory, Julie, that if vendors could charge for the buying process, it would be an entirely different buying process. It would be much
Yeah.
faster, I think.
Yeah.
You'd have a lot more serious buyers kind of coming out there with more serious efforts than kind of saying, "Oh, just give me a price." And that's one of the worst things I think you can do, by the way. Maybe you could give me your opinion on this too, Julie. I really always kind of cringe when buyers go out and just ask for a price.
Yeah.
That's a really dangerous thing. Not dangerous. It's just a really short-sighted thing to do. And you're probably eliminating very good vendor relationships and solutions by just doing it on the surface like that and looking at the price. Because really, until they get in there and work with you a little bit, it's very difficult to give you a very specific price, and a very specific solution, so especially in complex orgs. So don't
Yeah.
go out there and just get a price, right?
You use a sourcing
Yeah.
advisor for that instead to get a
Yeah.
ballpark or
Yeah.
some benchmarks. And what will happen is you'll just find that a strong vendor will then scope to the price that they've strapped themselves with, right?
Yeah.
the idea is to get in the door and to qualify yourself. And so those early pricings are not super actionable. And they can drive behaviors that, ultimately you might regret.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
All
So
right. You
Julia,
said you had something fun and lighthearted. Let's hear it.
yeah, a little lighthearted to finish out here. So this has been great. Look, reach out to us if you have any more questions. I think we probably could. I could go on and ask you more,
That's
but
all
I
right.
know we got to get to it, and everybody wants to probably get to their holidays. Hopefully, by the time this comes out, everyone will be on their holiday trips. But yeah, so look, I wanted to ask you about the concept. So we've both been through tons of contract redlining, right? And I know I've spent those late hours kind of redlining my pieces and parts that I had to in my world. And I remember one contract we worked on, and I think I have a small screen capture of the verbiage. I'll tweet it if I can find it. But I worked on a contract in I want to say it was 2012-ish. Fortune 100, big organization, was doing a full scale HRO deal, or wanted to, back then when people were still doing those. And they had a force majeure clause. Now, if you don't know what force majeure is, I know you do, Julie, and correct me if I'm wrong. It's essentially, I think it's a Latin phrase, a legal term for basically saying, under this clause, if some disaster beyond man's control happens, all bets are off in this contract. Is that a fair definition?
Yeah, I don't know if it's all bets are off, but it does say some outs, right? There's some language that allows you to make sure that you can have continuity.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All bets.
Yeah.
All bets
okay.
are off.
Sort of, right? So, okay. And I'm not a lawyer, so huge disclaimer, not an attorney. So, okay. So this customer came across, I've never seen this again. And I'm asking if you've ever seen this. They had a force majeure clause that specifically called out the event of a zombie apocalypse. And they required vendors to agree to it. And I first thought it was one of those things. I thought it was a joke. We all thought it was a joke. I thought it was one of those things like you hear rock stars have writers, right? And there are some rock stars, for example, Van Halen, I read one time, actually did the whole like no yellow M&Ms or whatever it was, green M&Ms or something like that. And the point of them doing it was because they had a very specific lighting set on their production that, if not properly put together, right, it could be dangerous, but it could also not perform the, whatever experience they wanted for their audience. So they had these clauses in there as gotchas to see if people were actually reading the writers, to make sure that the details of their other things were correct. It wasn't about being divas, apparently. So we'll assume. So do you think that something like that was a, let's see if they're really reading our contract? Or do you think that was or do you see this? Like, have you seen the zombie apocalypse in force majeure clauses, or have you seen something crazier?
No zombie apocalypse. And, I don't know. You're just going to be sorely disappointed if you're tossing something like that into a big paperwork process, hoping somebody catches it. I don't. This feels like the juice not worth the squeeze to me.
I know. That's the only thing I could think of. I was like, they can't be serious, right? Like that. But they made. And
you know what? If it stays in there, no harm, no foul, right? I don't know.
In case it happens.
So on either side, if it got put in there in the first place as a gotcha, I mean, so leave it in there, because somebody's going to read it and think, oh, this client has some kind of there's something wrong with them, but I don't think I have to worry about this, right? And so, I know. I don't know. I thought it was it's a poor trap.
I thought it was a test, but who knows? Anyway, so you've not seen a zombie apocalypse in your contract work?
I've not seen a zombie apocalypse in the contract, and I have to tell you, I don't have any insurance personally for a zombie apocalypse either. So I guess I'm not that worried about it.
All right, I think we'll be all right. I don't suppose they're coming for us anytime soon.
We should have done this before Halloween, Pete. before the year-end Christmas, year-end holidays.
Awesome. Well, look, this has been a great episode, and we'll be back very soon. So thanks you so much.
Enjoy the holidays, Pete, and everyone else. I hope
you too.
Wish for the best, and we'll see you in the new year.
Yep. Happy holidays, everyone.